In part 2, we covered the senses. We discussed the less well-known ones and how they impact our well-being. We look at the spiky sensory profile for autistics and how using stimming and avoidance to create a sensory diet can significantly improve mental health. So, how many senses do we have? In school, I was always taught it was 5. The correct answer is hundreds, but we usually split them into 8 different categories. The 5 everyone knows: taste, touch, smell, sound, sight, and the 3 that not everyone knows and are often misunderstood when they do: interoception, proprioception, and vestibular. There is also a 9th, neuroception, our sense of safety and danger, our panic monkey, but I prefer to keep that as a separate thing because panic monkey governs so many of our actions. Given we've only an hour, I won't go into detail with the big 5. I will cover them in a lot more depth in the 6-week course if you want to learn more about how they interact with our nervous system and affect how autistics interact with the world, such as why many of us are quite selective in what we can eat and why comfortable clothes are so important to our well-being. For now, I'll just cover the basics of the 3 less well-known ones. Our interoceptive senses relate to our internal body signals, including hunger, thirst, bodily functions, and even emotions, because we learn to recognize the emotions we're feeling from interpreting our internal body signals, such as our increase in heart rate or increase in internal temperature or muscle changes, etc. Proprioceptive relates to how our body interacts with our environment, our sense of location. For those of you who've been drunk or really unwell, have you ever had the sense that your body is floating, that the world is sliding around you? That's because your proprioceptive senses have stopped giving a strong signal of location. Vestibular relates to our inner ear, that bit of the body that tells us how we're moving in space: speed, rotation, angle, and balance. When we get car sick, it's because the signal from our ears says there's a lot of movement going on, but our eyes are telling us something different. It's why looking out of the window helps, because it stops some of the signal confusion. It's also why we can lose our sense of balance when we get sick, because the fluid in our ear no longer moves properly and doesn't pass back the right information to the brain. For most people, senses tend to be just something in the background, something we enjoy and trust they work properly. Autistics don't have that luxury. We tend to have what's called a spiky sensory profile, which means some of our senses work a lot better than the average, sometimes to a painful intensity, and some of our senses barely have a signal at all. For instance, I have no sense of hunger. So unless somebody reminds me, or I have it on schedule to eat, I could quite easily go a couple of days without eating and not realise it. And our air traffic controller has to compensate for this. We try to avoid or reduce on our high senses, sensory avoidant, and try to boost the signal on our low senses, sensory seeking. Think of it like trying to constantly recalibrate so our brain gets an accurate picture of what's going on. In addition, when we can't recalibrate, this doesn't just cause our brain to work harder, it can also damage our nervous system, overloading it with more intense senses and overworking it with the quieter senses. More intense senses can trigger panic monkey because they hurt. Quieter ones can trigger panic monkey because an alarm signal is coming in without a label. For instance, as I said before, I have a poor sense of hunger. So that's pretty problematic. My energy levels will drop, my processing starts to fail, and things can go bad quite quickly. But before I reach that point, instead of a hunger signal, panic monkey just gets an alarm that something's wrong. So my anxiety will start to rise, I will start to get angry, and I won't know why. And so I've learned to treat panic monkey a bit like a crying baby. Is it food? Is it body functions? Is it comfort? Is it temperature? We go through the list until we find the one that stops the anxiety. One of the biggest mistakes that parents make is not understanding this spiky profile and telling the child that what they're experiencing isn't real. Oh, it's not that loud. Why are you making such a fuss about nothing? How come you forgot to eat? Or go to the bathroom? What's wrong with you? Which leads us not only to learning not to trust our senses, but also blaming ourselves for not getting it right when everyone else can. We end up going into environments that are not healthy for our nervous system and ignoring the warning signs. The damage then goes on to cause mental health issues like severe anxiety and depression. Please don't get me wrong. Anxiety and depression happen for other reasons too. But not looking after our sensory system is a big cause for a lot of autistics. As someone later identified, I had a lifetime of severe anxiety and depression, to the point it affected my ability to function. But they were as much a part of my life as breathing. Medications and CBT made things worse and not better. So I just learnt to live with it. When I found out I was autistic and started researching, I found out about sensory stimming. Now, there's all kinds of stimming that do different jobs for the nervous system, but sensory is the best known. So just take a look at this slide. How many of these do you do consciously or unconsciously, or as a child before people told you stop doing it because it's weird? Because everyone stims, whether they're autistic or not. Autistic stims just tend to be more visible and more frequent. In the majority, stimming often occurs due to distress, whereas autistics often stim to prevent distress. Over time, I learned to tune in where my high signals were and where my low ones were, and what to do to help my brain balance them better. And when I did that, a lifetime of anxiety and depression disappeared like magic. But it's not magic. Because if I forget to look after my sensory profile, and that's really easy to do because you get complacent, then the anxiety and depression are back. But at least now I know why and I can do something about it. And it's not just an effect for me, because adults I've mentored and parents that I've coached with their children report the same thing. Get the sensory diet right and mental health improves significantly. In the 6-week speed course, I spend the second week going into sensory needs in far more depth. We look at how you can play the detective to create a sensory profile, and what stims help boost low signals, and how to create a tailored sensory diet. I also explain in detail about how our sensory profile is dynamic, and how it depends on other factors like processing, energy, environment, and past damage, and how these can make our highs become higher and our lows lower, or vice versa. They can bring them more to the middle if we get these things right. If you want to learn more, check out our speed course at insideout.com.